A Timeless Tale. By Mark Pircola. He watched patiently, for the event to occur from a safe distance. Patience was something his species was known for. Through science, and genetic manipulation, their lifespans were close to immortality. Their technology had no equal, anywhere in the galaxy. He himself, was a scientist and explorer. There was always a chance of some mishap, that might end one's life, while pursuing the unknown. But discovery and adventure gave his life meaning. He gazed out his portal, looking for an average little star, with 3 small planets. This spectacle had been well documented over the centuries, but he had never witnessed it personally. He didn't dare look at the timer. This event happened quickly, and there. No flash or warning, it just appeared. Professor Zhuan had seen it all in his 3,500 or so years. But this was something different. The most unique event ever discovered. In the 500,000 years, his people had been exploring the galaxy. A star that appeared for a few days every couple of years, and then vanished. This phenomenon had been discovered several thousand years earlier, during the first era of the time mapping of the galaxy. It was well known that time changed from the great singularity at the center of the galaxy to the outer rim. Time itself became faster as you moved away from the center. However, the galaxy was also filled with tens of thousands of smaller singularities and anomalies. When they began to explore the galaxy by folding space, it wasn't long before accidents began to occur. So, began a centuries-long effort to map the galaxy for spacetime gravitational-related anomalies. Folding space was much safer, since this was completed. At least for this sector. The process continues in others. This particular anomaly proved difficult to classify. There has been much speculation over the centuries as to how it developed. The leading hypothesis so far has speculated that 2 massive singularities, traveling in opposite directions, nearly collided. Their event horizons nearly touched, and they passed at incredible relative velocities. A rip in the spacetime between them occurred. This phenomenon created a bubble of spacetime that stretched between them. Their mutual gravity slowed them down into a very narrow orbital ellipse. Some time ago, this bizarre system was involved in an encounter with another star system. A star had been drawn into the spacetime anomaly during the vertices of their orbital ellipse. It has been trapped there ever since. It would certainly be torn apart when the singularities passed so closely with it in between. The fact that this star still exists, and that it appears and disappears, has been one of the greatest mysteries they had ever encountered. Eventually, their scientists determined the true nature of this phenomenon, and realized what they were witnessing. The star only appeared for a few days, as the singularities were at their vertices, because normally, this star does not exist in our time. It is stuck in a time loop. Each time the singularities approach, the star and its planets are pulled apart. Then as they recede, the spacetime envelope is pulled inside out. Time reverses, and loops back to when the star was first trapped. 2 massive singularities trapped in each other's gravity wells can do very strange things to the spacetime continuum. Time itself cannot flow backwards. But it can be repeated. This strange environment was closely studied for centuries. One of the planets of this star had an atmosphere and biological life. The planet was 90% ocean. The sea life forms were quite evolved, but the small land mass had only developed flora and insects. Because of the limited time domain in which this planet was now eternally trapped, no further evolution would ever take place. The unnatural nature of this little universe led to the experiment that many behavioral and alien studies scientists found intriguing. This experiment involved studying the behavior of sentient beings in such an environment. It was just too interesting not to try. They found a species that could flourish on the small land mass involved. They didn't need that many test subjects. Just enough to establish behavior patterns. 200 was considered adequate. They also had to supply enough food for the test subjects to last at least 700 planetary rotations. For ethical reasons, they were authorized to remove only subjects that were in immediate peril, and without intervention, would not survive. The selected species in a nearby system were in a pre-industrial cultural state. The collection of specimens would be covert. Their disappearance would not affect the natural development of their planet. The collection team documented their procedures, and were careful to sedate the specimens for transport. The largest group was a primitive community, living on a small island. The surrounding mainland area also contained many such small communities. However, due to an epidemic in the vicinity, most of these had been annihilated. This community was obviously doomed. The second group came from a small wooden vessel, headed into a cyclonic storm. Since the new planet was mostly water, this seemed like an obvious choice. They extracted the specimens, ship and all. The final group was taken from an unfortunate site that they happened across. A large wooden structure had caught fire, and some survivors were standing about freezing in the snow as the building burned. When the fire burned out, they would soon freeze, as none of them were adequately attired. They were all immature males. This group brought the total to 204 specimens. The experiment had been going on now for over 100 cycles. There was little interest in the results now, as most of the questions had been answered during the first 20. It had been assumed that the immature male group would blend with the group on the ship. They spoke the same language, and were from the same culture. This did not happen. They remained separate, antagonistic groups. The specimens on the ship were an aggressive group that the others avoided. Patterns of behavior did develop, that continued cycle after cycle. Because of free will, and the random nature of decisions made by sentient beings, each cycle was different than the others. Sometimes only marginally, and sometimes drastically. The experiment did have one major flaw. They knew the specimens would realize they were not on familiar ground. The lack of stars in the sky. The lack of salt in the sea. There were many things that would be unfamiliar. The flaw was in the days the stars came back. 3 days a year, from their perspective of course, the stars would reappear. These were the days they aged. Days that they could remember, from cycle to cycle. Eventually, they would remember looking up at the stars, mourning a lost friend. A friend that might be standing next to them, during the next cycle. They would all experience these ghost memories. They would come to realize that no one stayed dead. That none of their decisions or actions have any lasting consequences. This of course would change their behavior. When it became evident that this was occurring, the experiment was over. An experiment that would probably continue for another 300 million years. Although these specimens would not remember being sucked into space, along with the atmosphere, every 710 days, they would still be alive and well. Professor Zhuan thought a lot about that existence for the last few days. He could have chosen to go down to the planet. Live the same year over and over, forever. Or, face an uncertain amount of days, and an unknown future. Most living things don't have that choice. He concluded his modest lifespan of nearly 100,000 years was enough. His service vessel dipped into the atmosphere of the test planet, and it began the recovery of a few of the surveillance drones. He was obligated to remove 20 of them. They were sometimes damaged or destroyed, but were restored at the beginning of each time loop. They were sentient machines. These conscious minds were created millennia ago. They were given freedom to choose how long they existed, as any particular type of machine. They were guaranteed eternal life, as long as they performed whatever task their physical form was designed for. At least as best they could. 20 of these entities had fulfilled their contracted time. The time they had agreed to exist as a surveillance drone. They wouldn't remember all that time, but he was obliged to retrieve them anyway. Their sentient consciousness would be stored, until another machine had need of one. How long they remained in any machine was up to them. His ship and he had been together. Now for over 1,000 years. They were friends. The data the remaining drones collected was of little interest now, and eventually they would all be retrieved. As he began to prepare for the journey home, the vessel spoke to him. The ship communicated through an inner ear transceiver. It reported an unidentified living creature had been detected, coming out of the service vessel. The one that had just returned from the surveillance drone recovery mission. All the doorways had been sealed, and the ship awaited the order to vent the service bay to space. His ship was quite large. But he was the only living occupant. It took a lot of energy to fold space. The ship could have carried out this mission without him. But he wanted to see the phenomenon for himself. How an animal had gotten aboard the service vessel was a mystery. The service vessel did not land. It must be some sort of flying creature.
Identify,
he said aloud. There was a slight delay, and the ship responded.
Identified, species 7411, sentient biped. Test subject of the current drone surveillance on the planet.
This was unexpected. Not many things annoyed Professor Zuan. Unexpected problems were part of life. But they were still annoying.
Visual,
The professor said, as he turned to his viewing screen. As he turned, a 3D image appeared in front of him. The creature was small and nearly hairless, except for the top of its head. Like most of his species, the professor thought creatures not covered in long silky hair appeared naked and unintelligent. He had encountered thousands of sentient creatures over the centuries. This one was unremarkable, and obviously immature. It was, however, curious and bold. It had obviously followed the surveillance drones into the service vessel. The ship spoke again.
There was no threat of dangerous or flying animals listed for this planet. So, the security grid had not been engaged. This was my error.
agreed,
The professor said. Because the creature was sentient, he was reluctant to vent it into space. He could not return it either. At least not for another 710 days.
How much energy would be required to return this creature to its native planet?
The professor asked the ship.
2% and 3 days delay to our next destination.
The ship responded quickly.
Sedate it and proceed.
The professor said. He had other things to do, and put the matter off, until they arrived at this creature's native planet. The sentient surveillance drones were little constructs that were designed to monitor the activities of all the test subjects. They understood the language of these primitive creatures, to better understand their behavior patterns and motivations. They had no speech of their own, however, but could communicate with each other, and with the data storage satellites, through electronic transmissions. For the surveillance drones to be accepted as natural and unthreatening to the test subjects, their design was unique. The native planet of the subjects contained many species of flying creatures. However, these species were often sources of nourishment. Since these subjects were not used to seeing machinery of any sort, the drones were made using living cells, and designed to look like tiny versions of themselves. Except with wings. It was hoped that this would allow the drones to be seen as a natural part of their new world, and not as something to be afraid of, or eaten. This had proven successful, for the most part. The violent and aggressive nature of the test subjects on the wooden vessel, however, had led to the destruction of any drone they managed to capture. What motivated this behavior was still not understood. Professor Zuan interrogated the surveillance drones, and found out that it was this strange conduct of the ship dwellers that had created a breach of protocol. One of the surveillance drones had interceded in a test subject behavior. It had determined that keeping the test subject alive was imperative. It took it upon itself to help one of the subjects escape from the ship dwellers. This was not an error in judgment. However, the method used was of concern. The drone's size and shape were not conducive to efficient flight. To keep the wing size small and quiet, they were augmented with gravitational nanites. These microscopic entities generated a small gravity nullification field. They are designed to be absorbed into the skin, and embed themselves into living cells. They use the energy from within the cells to create the fields. When the cells die, they are flushed from the body with the dead cells. They must be replenished routinely. Each drone carried an ample supply. These nanites were used by the professor's species when encountering high-gravity environments. Using them on the test planet enabled the drones to fly. Using several thousand of them on the captured test subject allowed him to escape the ship by just flying away. This obviously had an effect on the behavior of the test subject. Fortunately, no one is interested anymore. It also explained how the creature managed to stow away aboard the service vessel. When they arrived at the creature's home planet, the professor checked the area in which the subject had been found. Although nearly 200 years of local time had passed, the society had just now entered an industrial era. The sailing ships had been replaced with steamships. Not much else had changed, however, including the language. Checking the exact location, he discovered that a new building stood on the site. It was still populated with immature creatures, but now male and female were present in the facility. Still sedated, the creature was returned to the site in darkness. Enough of the nanites had been flushed out of its body that it would no longer be able to fly. The ship asked if this return would cause any cultural contamination. The professor responded.
I don't believe it will. The creature knows nothing of what really happened to it. These creatures have no concept of how the universe works. The only thing it could possibly tell anyone is that it's been to a place in which the young, children, I believe, are what they call themselves, never grow up.
Postscript.
Yes, this is another retelling of an old story. It's been told and reimagined in books, plays, and movies for over 100 years. I hope you liked my sci-fi twist of this old fantasy tale. If you recognized the story in the beginning, or not until the last paragraph, I hope you enjoyed it.